Hey there, U.S. history students. This is Mr. Shear back with you again. Today we're talking about labor unions, possibly one of the driest subjects in American history, so I apologize for that in advance, but I will try to move through it as quickly as possible. We have discussed the haves, the people that get filthy, stinking rich off of the industrial age, and that's only a small, very, very small percentage of people. Today we will talk about the large majority of people, the working force, and just how much the Gilded Age and industrialization was not so great for them and what they do about it. So we'll get straight into the lesson. As I said, this one will probably move pretty quickly. So you'll have plenty of time to get into the assignment for the day as soon as we get through here. So I will share out the screen here and we'll get started. Possibly. There we go. Today we're talking about labor unions and the workers and how the workers fight for their rights during the industrial age because, well, things were pretty awful for the workers in general. So to start with, I want you to think about this. During the industrial age, many workers became dissatisfied with their working conditions and began to join together to fight for their rights. So I want you to think, what complaints do you think these workers had with their employers and the working conditions that they faced? So list 3 or 4 possible complaints that they could have had with working during the industrial age. Any 3 or 4 things that you think they might have complained about. And then the second question is this: which of these complaints you think workers still have today in the workplace? Now, a lot has changed between now and then, but I think some of those complaints people might still have today. Which do you think that is, and why do you think that's the case? So I'll give you a minute to answer that, and then we'll come back together here in just a minute or two. Okay. Now, I'm going to advance the slide because I'm listed some of these complaints here on the next slide, and I think you'll be able to see some of your answers that pop up here. During the Gilded Age or during the industrial era here in America, laborers or workers had a lot of complaints with their working situation. So some of the ones that you might have listed may have included low wages. They get paid very, very little or next to nothing in some cases. Minimal wages. They have long hours. Sometimes they're working 12 hours a day or more. Many of the factories are just altogether unsafe, whether it's the fact that the machines that they're required to work on could rip their limbs off, or the factory floor is got trash and broken glass or different things like that, or all kinds of different conditions in the factories that would make them unsafe for workers. A lot of times they had no breaks or no days off. They worked 7 days a week, and so that's a huge complaint on behalf of laborers. There was a big problem with child labor. Young kids that were working, and again, working in some of these dangerous conditions and these long hours and low wages. And finally, of course, there's no workers' comp or any insurance, so you get hurt on the job, your finger gets fed into a grinder, turns into sausage, then sorry, man, not only do you not get any money for that since you can't work, you're probably also going to get fired too. Shouldn't have fed your finger into a grinder, I guess. But that's kind of the deal with the way it is at the time. There's no workers' comp, there's no insurance. So, several of these probably you came up with. Which of these do you think, and you may have had other ones, which of these do you think that people still have today? Well, low wages or not being happy with what they make, that's pretty universal. People still do that. Long hours, now obviously they don't have 12-hour days anymore, and if you do, you get your overtime if you're a wage worker. So that doesn't mean, though, that sometimes you're asked to work too many hours or extra long hours in a week or something like that. So that's still a problem. It's just a little bit different. Unsafe factory conditions shouldn't be the case, although I'm sure it still happens. There shouldn't be a situation where no breaks or no days off, but again, I'm sure it happens. Child labor isn't as much of a problem, as well as workers' comp and insurance, but some of these things still persist, at least unofficially, in some places and some jobs. So why does this happen, or how is this problem? You're thinking, like, how can this just even happen? Like, how come somebody doesn't stop this? Well, that's what this whole laissez-faire thing is. The government has said hands off with businesses, and we talked about how that was a good thing for economic growth. It happens to be a not so good thing if you're a worker and you're being pretty much abused every day when you go to work. So laissez-faire and the government having their hands off of industry will lead to growth, yes, but it also leads to the mass exploitation of the workforce. And these problems get ignored by the government and other people that should regulate that kind of thing, but don't, because they're just saying, well, business is business, and you kind of do that. So that's just kind of the reality of the situation of the time. Now, as a result of this, workers do what they got to do. They come together and they unite. Think of it this way. If you complain, so some of you work, you have a job, you complain at work, and you're like, oh, man, I don't get paid enough. Like your boss is looking at you like, oh, yeah, I feel real bad for you, right? But like when everybody gets together and like, oh, no, we got to get paid. We got to get paid more. This isn't safe or anything else. When everybody gets together, the voice is a lot louder and the pressure is a little bit like, because what if everybody walks out? What if they don't want to work? Now they've kind of got some power. By yourself, you complain, it doesn't really make much of a difference. Together, everybody kind of complaining, that does make a difference. So workers come together and join what we call unions. You probably heard that word before because unions still exist today. There are unions. And these unions are groups that combine together to negotiate for their rights and work for better pay, working conditions in their workplace. They're all different types of unions, so it's really hard to define, but unions work in all kinds, in every industry, sometimes across different industries, to get better pay and get better working conditions. Obviously, the big companies don't like unions because, again, the workers are using their power together to kind of leverage the company. Now, if the company can go along and just sort of abuse the workers and pay them as little as they want, then that's great. But as soon as unions come in and start trying to put some pressure on them, obviously they're not going to like that very much. Corporations unions, and to be honest, even if you still have corporations and companies really try to discourage that. So this is what a union can do. So yeah, you get together, what can you do? Number one, you can act as a body to negotiate, or sometimes we also call that collective bargaining. And basically what that means is you have a group of people that represent all the workers that come and sit down at the table with the bosses or the managers or whoever, and the corporate leaders, and they come and say, hey, listen, this is what we want. This is what our people are complaining about. What are you willing to do for us? And the bosses might say, well, okay, we understand that you guys are really upset, so maybe we're willing to do this, but we're not going to do this for you. And they kind of negotiate and bargain back and forth to try to come to a resolution and improve the working conditions and pay for the workers in kind of a peaceable manner. All right. So that's one thing that unions would do. Another is striking. And you know what striking is? People, they basically walk out and refuse to work, because if they don't work, the factory doesn't make anything. They can't manufacture their goods, and they're kind of in trouble. So striking was a tool that a number of unions tried to apply during the time. And in some extreme cases, strikes often developed into more serious situations, and they've used rioting and more violent conflict to kind of really get their point across, but that's usually when it kind of flew off the rails and got a little out of control. So you have all different kinds of unions, unions that were organized by profession, unions that were organized with skilled workers and unskilled workers in different types of industries. So it didn't matter. There were different unions for all different kinds of workers of different types. So let's talk about a couple of the most famous ones, the best known from the time. There's all kinds of ones. You explore these a little bit in an activity at the end, but I wanted to introduce you to at least a couple examples. One of the most famous unions that develops at this time is the American Federation of Labor, led by none other than the historically renowned Samuel Gompers, who has one of the coolest names in all of history, really. And also one of the best mustaches in American history, as you can tell from the photograph there. It's quite the lip duster he's got. Samuel Gompers was a former cigar maker, and as such, he'd experienced some of the atrocities of the workplace, and so he organizes workers together. Now, his group, the American Federation of Labor, or also sometimes known as the AFL, had only skilled workers. So this doesn't include your people in the factories that just kind of pull the wrench all day long and just kind of do the same sort of simple thing. We're talking about craftsmen here, people that knew their trade. He excluded anybody that wasn't. So you're just general day labor workers were not part of that union. Most of them, and this is probably true for a lot of skilled workers at the time, but most of the members of the AFL were white males. And even in some cases, those that weren't white males were sort of intimidated not joining. But their whole deal is, things that they're fighting for is the opportunity to collective bargain. Didn't like striking. They did do some striking, but they didn't like striking. They wanted to sit down at the bargaining table. They also argued for something called closed shops. In other words, the union would go in and say to the employer, hey, we'll negotiate with you as long as you agree to hire only people that are in our union. So we can keep our part of the bargain and you can keep your part of the bargain. That's what we call a closed shop. It means that everybody that is hired by that company is part of that union, and in some ways that's kind of appealing to both parties. And finally, they fought for the limited 8-hour workday. And if you work more than 8 hours, of course, you get that overtime. But to limit the standard workday to 8 hours so that people got the proper amount of rest and everything else like that. So that was the American Federation of Labor, and that becomes one of the best known labor organizations of the time. Also the one for which we got our recent holiday. You had off Monday, that was Labor Day. American Federation of Labor is involved in pushing a worldwide recognition of labor kind of day. Originally, they thought it was going to be in May. As you know, it ends up in September. It was going to end up in May for a reason I'll talk about later. It'll come up, I promise. All right, so another famous union that you should know is a group of people called the Industrial Workers of the World, sometimes also known as the Wobblies. This was an extreme or radical labor group. So this is kind of like most of the labor groups, they're trying to work things out peaceably and stuff like that. The Wobblies are kind of like the off-the-rails, radical, crazy kind of people that, maybe you're having a strike and they're just going to be like, let's drop a bomb in the middle of this thing and see if we can't stir some up. So the Wobblies are much, much more extreme in this. They're led by a guy, they had lots of leaders, but one of their big leaders was a guy by the name of Wild Bill Haywood. Just by the name, that should indicate that they're kind of a little bit off the rails. They wanted everybody, skilled workers, unskilled workers, women, men, white, black, it didn't matter. They wanted all workers to be united in one gigantic union. All right, because they thought together, if everybody was united together, that they would have more power. A lot of the IWW was based on some communist or Marxist ideals of the time, that this power to the workers and the working class, and that they're really made up the crux of society. And so there were a lot of people that were kind of like with the IWW, because communism and Marxism was something that was feared quite a bit in the United States of America. So they were really seen as radicals politically as well. They become known for just kind of being a little bit crazy. As we mentioned there, they bring a lot of violence to the protests, real dramatic strikes and things like that. And so because of their radical behaviors and things like that, a lot of people tried to distance themselves from them. But their vision was definitely had a big impact on labor at the time. So how effective are these strikes? Generally, not really that effective. The power still lies with these big companies. So you strike and you don't want to go to work. A lot of times what happens is they just go out and they find more people that are willing to work. People that did that went in and filled those jobs were generally not looked upon as being very great people. They called them scabs because they hated that they would come in and you're trying to strike and you're trying to fight for better conditions, and these other people are just like, well, we'll work for crappy conditions. And they kind of ruin everything, right? So strikes and some of these methods didn't really make a huge impact, but that doesn't mean they didn't try. Some of these incidents almost boil out of control. The best known one is the Haymarket Riot of 1877. Happened in Chicago, and it followed a strike. I believe it was the McCormick plant or something. It's kind of escaping me right now, but it had turned into kind of like this more public. This was going on, and all this, as we mentioned before, a bomb explodes in the middle of all this, and then that obviously turns things a little bit out of control. As a result of this riot and the strike that kind of inspired it, there are several of the labor organizers that were there that are hanged, they're executed, and it's probably one of the bloodiest, most remarkable strikes of the time that anybody ever knew. This is also, I told you earlier that Labor Day they were thinking about putting it in May. The anniversary of the Haymarket Riot was was in May, and so they're like, hey, Labor Day should be in May on that anniversary. Well, the president of the United States at the time when Labor Day was created, his name was Grover Cleveland. He's like, we're not putting it in May because then people are going to be inspired by the craziness, and we're going to put that in September so they don't think about the Haymarket Riot when they're thinking about Labor Day. So anyway, that's a good example of that. They also had something called the Homestead Strike. This was Andrew Carnegie's steel plant. We talked about Andrew Carnegie and his power as a businessman, but he had a heck of a time controlling, so he didn't treat his workers that great. Okay, and so as a result, they strike. They bring in some scabs to fill in the work, but it becomes violent. Carnegie's actually on vacation at the time. He's off in Scotland taking a vacation. So his next guy in charge is leaving to deal with all this, and people are striking, and so they have to call in these Pinkerton guards that are going to try to keep the peace, and then shots get fired off. So now we get a couple people dead because shots are fired out, and so that becomes a pretty violent strike and very well known because of its involvement with Carnegie Steel as well. And probably one of the most interesting ones is the Pullman strike. Pullman he made railroad cars, and the Pullman company did. And the Pullman had this strange town where all his workers kind of lived there and worked there. And he tried to set up this kind of like bubble of sorts and have his people just kind of all be self-sufficient there. And he had doctors in there, and he had, their grocery stores, and he just didn't want his workers anywhere else. They had a curfew in the town, and there were certain regulations like you couldn't do certain things. He was basically trying to control every part of these people's lives. He built the houses, so he sold the houses to them, and then he cut their wages. And so it was kind of like this weird sort of like trying to control every aspect of your workers' lives. Well, when they cut wages, people go crazy. And so the Pullman strike, which is shown here on the right, becomes very well known because these people, they absolutely go crazy. And when they don't respond, when the Pullman company doesn't respond to their demands, they start destroying everything they created. So like they made railroad cars, so they start trying to blow these things up, turn them on fire. They burn down half of the stock that they made, and it becomes this gigantic riot. Again, things are destroyed, but in the end of it, nothing really changes that much. So even with all this violence, even with these labor unions, people are taking notice. People are kind of recognizing that there is a problem, but there isn't a whole heck of a lot that's actually changing. Something actually more disastrous is what's going to effectuate the change. In New York, this is probably like one of the textile capitals of the United States at the time. There's a lot of what they called sweatshops that were responsible for making a lot of the garments that were bought and sold in the United States. And these sweatshops were really well known for being poor conditions. They're crowded, they're dirty. Mostly women are working in there, and they're crammed in there, working long days in dirty and unsafe conditions with few breaks and everything else like that. That's where the sweatshops, where this name comes from, right? So I mean, it was terrible conditions. So it all kind of goes down on at this one incident. It's called the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory Fire. The Triangle Shirtwaist Company was in one of these skyscraper buildings in New York. Okay, they worked on, I think it was like the 6th or 7th floor. These ladies made these shirts, lined up in the sewing machines and everything, made these shirts. Well, due to, I don't know, they think it was either like a match or a cigarette butt or something like that, there's a fire that takes, and all these women, very few were able to get out. And most of the women that work there at the Triangle Shirtwaist Company, they're trapped inside while this fire burns. It continues to burn and burn and burn, and they can't get them out. And so what happens is that you got all kinds of people that die from this. 146 workers total. Some of them die because they're stuck inside. Some of them try to jump because they don't want to be inside the burning building. They jump and just land straight on the pavement. Not to be grotesque, but that's what you see in your picture to the left there. Yeah, people, and you can tell people are just watching below, and these ladies are just trying to save their lives, just jumping out of the building. Boom, straight onto the concrete. Crazy situation. 146 workers die by the time they were able to get it put out. And finally, something this extreme is where people look around like, you know what? I think we need to do more about the safety of the workplace. And so this causes all kinds of reforms. I've got a short little video clip that I want you to watch. I put this in with the lecture in the Google Classroom, and kind of under the same assignment. You can click on that video and watch it. It's going to describe the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire and kind of looks back on that a little bit. I want you to pay attention to what changed. After the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire happened, what changed? And what kind of changes did this motivate? So go ahead and watch that video, and there'll be a question that pops up here when we're about done. Okay, so this is the first real source of reform in the United States for workers, workplace safety, and all those kinds of things. They saw that this happened. They're like, wait a minute, we need some safety laws. People need to be accessed the staircase. They need to be able to have, they can't be locked inside their workplace and things like that. So this perpetuates a lot of change as far as that goes. Where all the striking and all that stuff didn't quite get anything done yet, this does. 146 people dying in a tragedy like this really motivates that change. So that takes us to the end. That's the intriguing history of labor unions in the industrial age. Very interesting. Begin to start to fight for things. Don't really get very far, though. Yeah, it is what it is. Right. So you've got an assignment to learn a little bit more about our labor unions. You'll find it there in the Google Classroom. It has, for those of you that are doing virtual online with Mr. Shear, it's a chart that you're going to fill in. Basically, it has 4 different labor unions. You're going to fill in information about who the leaders are, what their major goals are, and what's unique or sets that union apart from others. You'll be able to use the virtual textbook, Chapter 3, Lesson 4, to find those answers and fill in the chart. If you're doing this in class and you're watching this in class, you may have a different assignment here. It may be a Google quiz that covers the same topics that you can look up the answers for and kind of get you through. So that's the same idea. All right, so that will take you through the lesson for today. Labor unions, it is, and moving on to some new topics next time. Hopefully you were able to get something out of this, and if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out on the Google Classroom, or mine, or anywhere else. We'll talk to you next time.